My name is Bethany. I'm 27, and right now I'm swiping a worn debit card across the icy marble counter, desperate for the money. The cashier glances at my threadbare coat, and there's undisguised disgust in her eyes. She's about to swipe the piece of plastic I've ignored for 5 long years. I need to withdraw exactly $1,000 to pay urgent medical bills before the hospital kicks me out. But this humiliation is nothing compared to the day my life shattered forever. 5 years ago, in our family living room, the air was thick with the scent of funeral lilies, and the family lawyer monotonously read my parents' last will. I sat, petrified, as he announced that the entire real estate portfolio was going to my older sister. She didn't even wait for the end before snatching the small envelope with my name on it, tearing it open, and finding a single debit card. Then she threw it right in my face, with such pure, chilling disgust. "Mom and Dad just felt sorry for you," she hissed, "because you're just adopted." Without a trace of mercy, she pointed to the door. "Take your measly $1,000 as final payment and get out. Now." I was thrown out into the icy night with nothing but this piece of plastic. And now, at the bank, the teller swipes her card and her face changes. The brazen arrogance vanishes, replaced by absolute animalistic terror. She leans so close to me that I can feel her breath and whispers a single phrase. Those words chill my blood, and the world collapses in a soft roar. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to find out what the teller whispered and how this discovery forever shattered my sister's life. Let's go back 5 years, right after the funeral. It all happened so quickly that I still couldn't believe it was happening. My parents were gone. They died in a terrible accident after a fire at the family factory. Just a few days ago, they were alive, calling me with that same gentle voice. And then everything collapsed in an instant. The heavy oak door of our estate slammed behind me with such a final thud, as if it were burying me alive. Bethany Sterling was no more. I turned away from the warm hallway, smelling of wax and money, and stepped straight into a piercing Chicago blizzard. The city was buried under layers of ice and snow. My thin black morning dress was instantly soaked through, the snow clinging to the fabric, penetrating to my very bones, to an icy numbness somewhere in the depths of my brain. I wandered down the long driveway in a complete daze. My teeth chattered, tears froze in prickly streaks on my cheeks. The physical cold was unbearable, but it paled in comparison to the icy emptiness growing inside me. I'd been thrown out, like trash. People who swore they'd be family. I walked through the mounting snowdrifts, block after block, no coat, no clothes, nothing. My sister Valerie wouldn't even let me pack a bag. I knew I wouldn't survive a night on the streets. With trembling, almost stiff fingers, I fumbled for my phone in my pocket and dialed the only number guaranteed to answer even in the dead of night. My best friend Sarah picked up on the second ring. "Go, now," she said, without asking a single unnecessary question. That night, I curled up on her sagging beige sofa in her tiny apartment, listening to the wind howl through the window like a lost soul. Sarah silently brought me a blanket and a cup of scalding coffee. I stared blankly at the wall, too stunned by the betrayal to utter a word. Her place was cramped and smelled of cheap laundry detergent, but it offered what my home had deprived me of, a sense of security. I was immensely grateful for her silence. One word of concern and the fragile shell of composure I desperately tried to maintain would have shattered into pieces. The next morning, harsh reality set in. I emptied my pockets onto Sarah's coffee table. All I had left in the world was the worn-out debit card Valerie had tossed in my face like a handout. I picked it up, and a wave of such furious delirium tremens rose within me that for a moment it drowned out my grief. I bent the plastic until it turned white at the fold. I wanted to snap it, break it in half, and throw the pieces in the trash. Taking that money would have meant accepting their insult, accepting that I was nothing more than an adopted child, deserving only a measly $1,000 as a parting gift. For a long time, I couldn't unclasp my fingers, but finally, slowly, I let go of the card and tucked it into the deepest, most hidden compartment of my wallet. I decided not to keep it for the money, no. It was my tangible proof, a trophy snatched from the jaws of the cruelty I'd fled. I moved out of Sarah's apartment a week later. I swore to myself never to be a burden to anyone again. The next 5 years burned all that was soft and naive from my spoiled daughter. They forged a different woman, hardened by fatigue and stubbornness. I got a job at a seedy cafe on the south side of town, the Rusty Spoon. The air there was forever permeated with the smell of burnt grease and stale coffee grounds. My days merged into an endless cycle of double shifts and sleepless nights. I served rude customers who left tips with change scraped from the bottoms of their pockets. I scrubbed sticky floors until my knees were raw. I washed mountains of greasy dishes until my hands were blistered and cracked. Every dollar, every cent went straight to student loans and the rent for the basement closet that flooded with every heavy rain. I learned to survive on kitchen scraps and mended my clothes until the threads were raw. Asking for help was unthinkable. While I was calculating whether I'd have enough for a pack of cheap noodles, snippets of news about my former family reached me through old acquaintances. Whispers circulated that Valerie and her husband Derek were basking in luxury within the walls of my orphanage. They talked about their lavish parties, where champagne flowed freely and guests trampled their mother's expensive furniture under their heels. Derek, rumor had it, swapped sports cars like gloves, parking them in the very same driveway I once shoveled snow. They squandered our family fortune with such reckless arrogance, as if its source were inexhaustible. I forced myself to suppress this knowledge, focusing entirely on surviving in the city shadows. That naive girl who begged for recognition at the funeral was left to die in the snow that night. All that remained was a shadow of her, a woman who trusted no one and nothing. 5 years later, on a frosty Tuesday morning, the fragile stability I had built so painstakingly crumbled in an instant. In the midst of the lunch rush at the cafe, I carried a pot of boiling soup and spilled it on my hand. The pain was blinding, white. Second-degree burns, a medical emergency. The doctor ordered me to stay home for 2 weeks to avoid infection. But my manager only sneered coldly, "If you don't show up for work, you don't get a cent." Losing 2 weeks' wages was devastating. I was living paycheck to paycheck, without a single dollar in reserve. That same morning, the landlord slipped a bright red eviction notice under my door. The pharmacy wanted payment for ointment and antibiotics, without which my hand would fester. I sat on the edge of my mattress, clutching my throbbing, bandaged limb, and realized with chilling clarity that I had no other options. The last straw in the world for me turned out to be that same tattered piece of plastic that had been tucked away in a secret corner of my wallet for 5 years. Using that money, it would be like publicly admitting defeat. I wanted to prove to Valerie that she was right in thinking I was a pathetic charity case, incapable of surviving on my own. But the gnawing, burning pain in my arm and the terrifying prospect of finding myself on the snowy street forced me to swallow that pride. I put on my most threadbare coat, covering my sling, and, my head bowed in shame, trudged 10 blocks to the nearest Liberty Trust Bank branch. The bank's hall greeted me with a frightening, artificial warmth and the scent of expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the stench of fat and despair that had ingrained my skin and clothes. I stood in a long line, trying to ignore the disapproving glances of businessmen in impeccable suits. They backed away from me as if poverty were a contagious disease. Finally, I reached the marble counter. Behind it, a young woman with an impeccable manicure and cold eyes waited. Her gaze slid over me with undisguised disgust, then fell on the tattered card I'd placed on the glass surface. The plastic was worn white at the edges and bent in the middle, a remnant of that night 5 years ago when I'd tried to break it. She picked it up with her fingertips as if she were holding something dirty and dangerous. Without even trying to hide her skepticism, she turned it over, checked the signature, and then smirked, looking directly at me. "Are you sure there's nothing wrong with this card? It looks like it belongs in the trash." I felt my cheeks flush with shame, but I forced myself not to look away. I no longer had the strength to fight for my dignity, only for survival. "Just check my balance, please. I need this money today," I managed, my voice hoarse. The cashier rolled her eyes in mock irritation, sighed loudly, and slowly, as if doing a favor, swiped her card. I held my breath, mentally calculating every cent of that $1,000. I'll pay off my landlord, buy my medications, and never set foot in here again. I waited for the short, stinging sound of confirmation. But instead, the silence of the banking hall was shattered by a piercing, blood-curdling wail of a siren. This wasn't a normal refusal. This was a continuous, high-pitched shriek, signaling a violation of a level I hadn't even suspected. Every person in the lobby froze and stared at me. The guards at the entrance nervously placed their hands on their holsters. My chest tightened with a chilling terror. The thought struck like lightning. Valerie. She reported the card to the police. Stolen. They're arresting me now. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out. I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for the click of the handcuffs. But the cashier's reaction was more terrifying than a siren. Her face, haughty a second ago, had completely lost its color, turned waxy. Her hands shook so violently she almost dropped her card. She stared at the computer screen, which was flickering with a bright, ominous scarlet light, illuminating her features from below like hellfire. And her gaze, there was no longer disgust in it. There was an all-consuming, animalistic fear directed at me. She fumbled for the intercom and, without taking her frantic gaze from me, dialed the number with trembling fingers. Her whisper was hoarse with terror. "Mr. Manager, counter 5, immediately. We have a read code on a priority trust card. Yes, the owner is right here." Moments later, I was sitting in a luxurious VIP meeting room, the atmosphere so oppressive that my ears were ringing from the silence. I was sunken in a plush leather sofa that probably cost more than my entire income for 5 years. In my hands was a porcelain teacup, so finely crafted that I was afraid I'd crush it. I was too terrified to take a sip. The branch manager, the man who usually hovered around the room like a demigod, was now pacing in front of me, wiping sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. Not a trace of his former arrogance remained. He was shaking with a strange mixture of awe and panic. He carefully placed my tattered card on the polished mahogany tabletop between us, like a sacred relic. I stared at the worn plastic, waiting for them to announce my arrest for fraud. After all, it only had $1,000 on it. Only $1,000. The manager finally stopped, took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the trembling in his voice, and looked at me. His gaze was piercing. "Miss Bethany, I deeply apologize for the misunderstanding. This is not a debit card." He paused, as if gathering his courage to speak. "This is the master key to the Sterling Family Trust Fund, established 5 years ago." I just blinked. His words didn't make any sense in my frazzled mind. I tried to ask something, but my throat tightened, preventing a sound from coming out. He opened the leather folder he'd brought with him and turned it toward me. The page was lined with columns of numbers. He extended his finger and pointed to the very bottom line, where a string of numbers stretched almost across the page. He spoke the next phrase solemnly, almost ceremoniously. "The current account balance is $5 million. That's it. Everything stopped. The blood drained from my face so violently that the room before my eyes began to swim and spin. His voice sounded distant, as if underwater. He was explaining something about my parents' enormous life insurance policy, the double payout clause in the event of an accident, about active investments, high-yield stocks, interest accruing exponentially all these years. I sat there, completely petrified. 2 realities, 2 parallel worlds in which I lived, collided within me with monstrous force. I was starving. I was skimping on noodles. I scrubbed floors and endured insults, counting every cent. And all this time, all these 5 long, painful years, in my tattered wallet lay this card. And in it, $5 million. $5 million. The irony struck my solar plexus, sharp as a knife and bitter as wormwood. I was gripped by a wild, hysterical spasm between sobbing and laughter. Before anything had time to settle in my topsy-turvy mind, The door to the VIP room creaked heavily and slowly opened. A figure I hadn't seen since the funeral stood on the threshold. The family lawyer, Mr. Whitaker. In his hand was a massive leather briefcase, seemingly unwieldy from the weight of secrets. He looked much older than I remembered. More gray hair, deeper wrinkles around his eyes, sadness etched into his very face. He nodded silently, solemnly to the manager, who, with a final respectful glance at me, hurried away, leaving us alone. Mr. Whitaker sat down opposite me and placed a thick stack of tightly sealed envelopes on the table next to the map. His gaze, full of pity and a kind of senile sorrow, twisted my stomach into a tight knot. I remembered him standing in the corner of the living room, indifferent and silent, while Valerie kicked me out. And I hated him for that silence to this day. He placed his palm on the folder and gently pushed it toward me across the polished tabletop. Your parents knew this day would come, Bethany. They made me swear not to approach you until you activated the card yourself. Read it. Here is the whole explanation. I took the top envelope, and my heart shattered, froze, stopped. On the front was the familiar, elegant slant of my mother's handwriting. My fingers trembled so wildly that I almost dropped the page. A wave of nausea rose in my throat. I tore open the seal, unfolded the paper, and the words, "Ghost-written 5 years ago," appeared before me. The letter confirmed everything the manager had said. In black and white, I was the sole beneficiary of their entire liquid fortune. The shock, cold, and stunning, instantly melted into rage, a blinding, white, searing rage that coursed through my veins like molten lead. I remembered hungry nights on bare floors, the humiliating stench of cleaning products, the acrid tears in the toilets of the Rusty Spoon. And Valerie, meanwhile, the queen of my house. I looked up at Mr. Whitaker through a haze of tears and anger. Why? Why such torture? This didn't feel like a gift. It felt like an elaborate, cruel game in which my life became bargaining chip. 20 minutes later, I sat alone. In front of me lay the iPad my lawyer had provided. I stared at the black, soulless screen for a long moment before, with trembling fingers, I found the strength to press play. The screen flickered, and there they were, my parents, sitting side by side on the old, familiar beige sofa in our living room. They looked dead tired. Their faces were lined with a deep exhaustion I seemed to miss when I was around them. My father cleared his throat nervously. My mother reached out and squeezed his hand in hers, a supportive gesture, as if they were about to tell me something terrible. Their eyes, they held all-consuming love mixed with a chilling, animalistic fear. That gaze pierced right through the thick, hardened shell I'd built around my heart over the years. My father spoke. His voice was serious, heavy, demanding my absolute attention. He began explaining the nightmare they'd secretly endured in their final months. It turned out they'd discovered Valerie was mired in monstrous gambling debts. She'd mortgaged her future inheritance to borrow money from dangerous people. People who were beginning to threaten not only her, but the safety of the entire family. They realized Valerie planned to seize all their assets immediately after their deaths to pay off her debts. And that would leave me with absolutely nothing. He pauses, wipes a traitorous tear from his cheek, and then looks directly into the camera. His gaze burns through the screen and time. We found out about Valerie's debts, my dear. If we'd left you the money openly, she would have sued you, stalked you, or done anything else to get her hands on it. We couldn't let that happen. The video continued. They explained their desperate strategy. Their only goal was to ensure my long-term survival, even if it meant breaking my heart here and now. They deliberately left the estate to Valerie as a massive, glittering decoy, because it was the most visible asset, the one she coveted most. They knew her greed would force her to focus solely on the house, on the lifestyle, completely ignoring the pittance they left me. If they had divided the fortune equally, or given me a share, Valerie would have dragged me into endless lawsuits, or come with threats, and she wouldn't have left until she'd taken everything. And that debit card, that card with $1,000, It was meant as the final insult, to make me leave quickly without looking back, far, far away, out of the reach of Valerie and her looming creditors. Then my mother leaned even closer to the camera. Tears, real, salty tears, streamed down her pale cheeks as she explained. They secretly transferred all their liquid assets into a trust fund, and they put the cruelest lock on it, a 5-year gestation period. They calculated everything. They figured it would take Valerie exactly 5 years to squander the value of the house and hit financial rock bottom. They wanted to be sure that by the time the money was mine, she would be powerless, incapable of harming me. She reached out and touched the screen, her fingertips trembling, as if, through years and death, she were trying to stroke my hair. We had to be cruel to be kind. We needed you far away from her, safe, independent. Forgive us. Forgive us for this pain, my reckless, my brave girl. The screen went dark, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of the room. The weight of their sacrifice, their calculation, their love fell upon me with all its weight, pinning me to the chair. I pressed the cold iPad to my chest, to the place where my heart beat, and doubled over. What came out of my throat wasn't a scream, not a cry, but a sobbing, animalistic moan, a tangle of 5 years of pain, hatred, and epiphany. For 5 years I cursed their names, believed they considered me second class. Adopted. And I was wrong. Absolutely, sickeningly, catastrophically wrong about everything, from that day on. They didn't banish me from a lack of love. They sent me away from its excess. They agreed to play the villains in my story. They accepted my hatred and died knowing I despised them, just so I could stand here today, alive, free, a millionaire. That pain, that gnawing poverty that lived within me like a shadow of bones, it evaporated in an instant. Something new took its place, a deep, aching, all-forgiving gratitude for those I had lost without ever fully understanding. I forgive you, I breathed into the silence, and the words sounded like a vow. I forgive you for everything. While I sat in this plush, expensive prison, absorbing the life-changing truth, Mr. Whitaker painted a grim picture of what was happening on the other side of town, in my former home. As executor of the trust, he kept a close eye on the estate, and he informed me that the bank had just served the final foreclosure notice that morning. I learned the details later. The moment the sheriff slapped a bright red eviction notice on the massive front door, the atmosphere in the mansion descended into absolute chaos. Valerie and Derek were in a hysterical panic. They had refinanced their already paid-off house 3 times to support their luxury living and their guaranteed cryptocurrency investment, which had plummeted overnight. The walls that had once held my parents' laughter and whispers now echoed with piercing screams. The marriage was crumbling under the weight of financial ruin. Neighbors who overheard the commotion reported that the argument was explosive. Derek, they said, stopped pacing and pointed a trembling finger at my sister, his eyes bulging with accusation. "We're going to be thrown out on the street, Valerie." "Tomorrow, I told you not to bet everything on this damn scam." But Valerie was never good at admitting guilt. In response, she threw a heavy porcelain vase, the very antique Mom loved so much, at the wall, and she shrieked with equal venomous fury, "Shut up, Derek. It was actually your brilliant idea to refinance the house." The news of their collapse evoked in me a feeling I hadn't felt in years, a cold, pure, almost sacred sense of justice. I left the bank with a large cash advance, and the first thing I did was erase the physical traces of my poverty. I walked into the hospital billing department, a place I'd once been afraid to even call, and paid all my medical bills in full. I watched the balance drop to 0 and felt a surge of such power that my vision darkened. Then came an elite boutique downtown, a place whose windows I'd once been afraid to look into for fear of feeling dirty. I bought a custom-made black wool coat, an elegant dress, leather boots that kept my feet warm in seconds. I looked in the fitting room mirror, And what I saw there wasn't a victim. I saw strength, a woman to be reckoned with. The eternal fear in my eyes that had lived in me for 5 years was replaced by a steely, unyielding determination to finish what my parents started. Mr. Whitaker met me that same day in a quiet, expensive cafe. To discuss the final phase of their plan, he placed a thick folder on the table. Due to the scale of Valerie's debts and the breach of all covenants, the bank has expedited the process, he said, tapping his finger across the documents. The house will be sold tomorrow morning. A blind, urgent auction. This is the only chance to secure the property before it hits the open market. I looked at the lawyer. His gaze was hard as steel, and inside everything was burning with anticipation. This wasn't just getting the house back. This was getting back a stolen life, a dignity, a history they had tried to erase from me. "Buy it, Mr. Whitaker," I said, my voice level, cold, without a shadow of doubt. "I authorize you to place the highest bid through a shell company. Price is irrelevant. I must be the owner by tomorrow afternoon. If we act anonymously, they won't know who the buyer is until the very last second. Is that your plan?" His pen paused over the document. "Exactly this." I signed the paper with a firm, confident flourish. "I want to see her face, the very moment she realizes who really owns the roof over her head. Keep my name a secret until the final minute." While I was securing my future, Mr. Whitaker recounted how Valerie had spent her last hours in the house, in a frantic, pitiful search for a lifeline. She called every contact on her phone. Old college friends, distant relatives, business partners she had once humiliated. She begged, tried to scrounge up any amount of money. But rumors of her monstrous debts had already leaked into all circles. One by one, people turned away from her, knowing she was drowning and had burned all her bridges behind her. She even got through to our rich aunt, but she only laughed down the phone, reminding her how Valerie had treated me in front of everyone. The call ended in tears. Valerie collapsed on the floor among half-empty boxes she'd been too proud to finish packing, finally realizing that she was facing a poverty far more cruel and hopeless than the one she'd once abandoned me to. A week later, the quiet street of my childhood was transformed into a chaos of flashing lights and twisted faces. I watched the scene from the back seat of a black sedan with tinted windows, parked a block away. 2 sheriff's cruisers sat haphazardly tucked into the lawn. An eviction truck, hired by the bank, lazily smoked on the curb. The front door of the estate stood wide open, and shouts emanated from within, officers trying to reason with a couple barricaded in the hallway. I could hear Valerie screaming across the street, her voice hoarse with rage. She was shouting about her rights, about private property, about trespassing. It was a pathetic final stand from a woman who had ignored every legal notice for the past 6 months. I nodded to the driver. The car pulled smoothly into motion and pulled up right in front of the familiar cast-iron gates I used to open manually when I lived here. The car stopped. I took a deep breath, reining in the adrenaline coursing through my veins, and opened the door. I stepped out onto the pavement. In my custom-made wool coat, my designer glasses completely obscured my gaze. The sound of my leather boots beating a precise rhythm on the road cut through the din of the argument like a cold metronome, counting down the final seconds of their world. I passed the stunned movers and tired police officers. They looked at me with relief, seeing in my appearance at least some control over the situation. Valerie rushed out onto the porch. Her hair was tousled, her face swollen and covered in red blotches from hours of sobbing and hysteria. There was no trace left of the socialite. She desperately waved a crumpled piece of paper at the officer, and then she noticed me, standing at the foot of the steps. She didn't recognize me. She didn't recognize her own sister in these clothes, in this pose, in this aura of absolute power. She decided I was another bank emissary, here to crush her completely. She rudely ran down the steps and pointed a trembling finger at my face. Her voice broke, hoarse with hatred. "Who are you? Did the bank send you to make fun of me? Get off my property, immediately." I didn't flinch. I didn't retreat even an inch. because I was no longer the frightened girl I'd allowed myself to be bullied. Slowly, with icy calm, I raised my hands in thin leather gloves and removed my glasses. Our gazes met. Realization hit her with such physical force that she literally bowed, deprived of air. The color drained from her face, leaving a deathly, waxy pallor. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, mindlessly, like a beached fish. Her brain refused to accept the reality of what stood before her. At that moment, Derek tumbled out of the house, dragging a box of electronics. He saw me, and the box crashed onto the concrete with a loud thud, scattering shards of plastic and metal. Silence fell. Deaf, oppressive, suffocating. Mr. Whitaker broke it. He stepped forward from behind the police officers, holding a stack of documents with impressive seals. He cleared his throat and spoke loudly, clearly, for the entire street to hear. The property was sold at blind auction this morning. By law and right, the sole and rightful owner of Sterling Hall, with all lands and buildings, with immediate possession, is Miss Bethany Sterling. And he turned, bowing respectfully, gesturing toward me. The lawyer's words hung in the air, and then struck like a physical force, knocking the wind out of everyone present. The balance of power on this street had shifted with a deafening crash, and I was the center of this new world. Derek was the first to come to his senses. His survival instinct clearly outweighed everything else: his conscience, his shame, even his feigned loyalty to his wife. He looked at Valerie with sudden, undisguised disgust, and then practically rushed toward me. A pitiful, slavish smile froze on his face. "Bethany, I always knew you were special," he babbled, his words weaving into a sticky web of lies. "It was all her. She controlled everything. She forced me. I'm a victim. Do you understand? A victim of her manipulation." He tried to grab my hand, but I stepped back, leaving his fingers clutching at nothing. It was sickening to see a man so easily betray the one he shared his life with, just to grasp at straws. Valerie stared at him in mute disbelief, and then her gaze, filled with animal terror and despair, returned to me. The arrogance that had been her essence evaporated without a trace. She remained a broken woman, in whose eyes the realization of complete and utter loss slowly dawned. She collapsed to her knees on the dirty asphalt of the driveway and clutched the hem of my expensive coat with trembling hands. "Bethany, please, we're sisters." Her voice broke into sobs, false and desperate. "Blood is thicker than water. You won't let your own sister live on the streets." I stood on the porch of my home, my childhood home, and looked down at her. My face held not a drop of the compassion she so craved. She babbled on about our shared past, about the sanctity of family, her fingers fumbling helplessly with the fabric. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. That morning, Mr. Whitaker had uploaded a very specific file from the estate's security archives. I found it, pressed play, and turned the screen right in front of her. In the grainy black and white video filmed 5 years ago by the front door camera, a young Valerie was throwing my pitiful belongings into the snow, and she screamed. Her voice, distorted with hatred, burst from the speaker with chilling clarity. "Get out, you genetic error. Disappear. Freeze to death on the streets, you piece of trash." Valerie's sobs stopped instantly. She stared at the screen, at her own reflection, and her eyes showed pure, undiluted horror. Horror that I hadn't forgotten anything. Not a single second. I put the phone away. I stepped forward, looming over her hunched figure like a judge about to pronounce sentence. I looked straight into her tear-stained, fear-filled eyes and spoke slowly, clearly, emphasizing each word like a nail. "You told me that night that I was a stranger to this family, that I didn't belong here, that because I was adopted, I was nothing to you, that blood was thicker than water, and my blood wasn't here." I paused, letting the words sink in. "Well, Valerie, I've always respected your point of view, and I'll treat you exactly as you wanted, as a stranger." I turned sharply to the head of the private security detail I'd hired to accompany the lawyer and nodded toward the gate. Get these people off my property immediately and make sure they never set foot on this street again. Two burly men in uniform stepped forward. They grabbed Valerie and Derek by the arms, not roughly, but with unshakable force. Derek began to scream, shouting out more excuses, begging for at least a small loan. Valerie howled my name, piercingly, madly, desperately, as she was dragged down the very same alley where she once strutted like a queen. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I watched until they were pushed through the heavy cast-iron gates, until they slammed shut with a final metallic clang. They were left on the side of the road, with nothing but the clothes on their shoulders, alone with the weight of their debts and the impending judgment. The crowd of neighbors and the police gradually dispersed. Silence fell. I was left alone in front of my large, empty, reclaimed house. I turned and walked inside. The air in the hall was still thick with the energy of the scandal. I passed the living room, where the furniture hid under white covers like ghosts. I climbed the wide, grand staircase to the second floor. I walked without stopping until I reached the door to the master bedroom. Their bedroom. I gently pressed the handle and entered. The air here smelled different. A faint, barely perceptible trail of my mother's lavender perfume lurking in the folds of the curtains. I walked up to their large canopy bed, the very one they'd sat on the edge of, reading me bedtime stories. I sat down. The silence here wasn't empty. It was full, warm, like a ghostly, tender embrace. I ran my hand over the soft covers, closed my eyes, and allowed myself to see them for the last time, sitting next to each other. "Thank you," I whispered into the silence of the room, and tears finally streamed down my cheeks. Not tears of pain, but tears of gratitude, aching and cleansing. Thank you for agreeing to be the villains in my story so that I could be the heroine of my own. I promise I will make you proud. And I vowed, right there, in the center of their space, saturated with love, I vowed that this state would not become a throne for vanity. It would become a bridge, a foundation. I will create a foundation in their name. A foundation that will provide scholarships and shelter. Not just shelter, but a safe home. For those who, like me, were abandoned. For foster children, orphans, those betrayed by those who should have protected them. I will turn my pain into a shield for those who don't yet have their own armor. Thank you. Thank you so much, so sincerely, for walking with me on this long, difficult journey from the snowy alley to this quiet bedroom. Your attention is a priceless gift. It's important to me to know what you think. Share in the comments. Do you think I was within my rights? Or did my revenge turn into cruelty?